In the early 18th century, England stood at a quiet threshold, not yet aware that it was about to become the engine room of a transformation that would redraw the contours of human life. The countryside still defined the nation's rhythm. Most people lived in villages shaped by seasons, harvests, and inherited customs. Work was intimate and slow, bound to daylight and muscle. Spinning, weaving, blacksmithing, farming, and brewing took place in cottages or small workshops, where skill passed from hand to hand and generation to generation. Wealth existed, but it was unevenly distributed and largely tied to land. Power flowed from aristocratic estates, the monarchy, and a merchant class that was growing but still constrained by the limits of human and animal labor. England was not poor, but it was narrow in scale. What it produced slowly. What it consumed, it could mostly see with its own eyes. Yet beneath this familiar surface, pressure was building. England's population was rising, driven by relative political stability, improvements in agriculture, and declining mortality. More mouths needed more food, more clothes, more tools. At the same time, England's global reach was expanding. Colonies in the Americas and trading posts across Asia and Africa fed raw materials into British ports and pulled finished goods back out into the world. Cotton from India and later the American South, sugar from the Caribbean, tea from China, and timber from the Baltic flowed into the country. Money accumulated not only in land but in trade, finance, and speculation. London was becoming a financial nerve center, where credit, insurance, and investment could mobilize capital on a scale unimaginable a century earlier. England was no longer just a nation, it was a node in an emerging global system, and that system demanded speed, volume, and consistency that traditional methods could not provide. The first cracks appeared in the textile trade, long one of England's most important industries. Cloth was essential, universal, and endlessly demanded. But spinning thread by hand was painfully slow, creating a bottleneck that limited output no matter how skilled the weaver. When machines like the spinning jenny, the water frame, and later the spinning mule appeared, they did not simply make work easier. They altered the logic of production itself. These machines concentrated labor, required fixed power sources, and rewarded scale. Water wheels along rivers powered early factories, pulling workers away from dispersed rural homes and into centralized buildings. For the first time, production was organized not around family units or guild traditions, but around machines that set the pace and dictated the rhythm of work. Time itself became something to be measured, disciplined, and enforced. Factory work demanded obedience rather than craft. Workers rose before dawn, labored for 12 to 16 hours, and returned home exhausted. Children were prized for their small size and nimble fingers, crawling beneath machines or working in narrow mine shafts where adults could not fit. Injuries were common. Compensation was rare. If a worker could not work, they did not eat. The old social safety nets of village life, however limited they had been, unraveled under the pressures of urbanization. Poverty became more visible, more concentrated, and more frightening to those who benefited from the new economy. Workhouses, designed to deter dependency through harsh conditions, became symbols of a system that valued productivity over dignity. Yet resistance grew alongside exploitation. Workers were not passive recipients of industrial change. They organized strikes, smashed machines they saw as threats to their livelihoods, and formed early unions despite legal repression. The Luddite movement, often caricatured as irrational opposition to technology, was in reality a protest against the loss of bargaining power and economic security. As industrial capitalism matured, workers began to articulate broader demands: shorter hours, safer conditions, fair wages, and political representation. Chartism, one of the first mass working-class movements, linked economic injustice to political exclusion, arguing that without the vote, workers would always remain vulnerable to exploitation. Industrialization also reshaped gender roles and family life. In early factories, women made up a significant portion of the workforce, particularly in textiles. Their wages were lower than men's, reinforcing economic dependence even as they contributed substantially to household income. Over time, as middle-class ideals of domesticity took hold, a cultural divide emerged. Respectable femininity became associated with the home, while wage labor was increasingly framed as masculine. This shift obscured the continued economic contributions of working-class women and justified inequalities as natural rather than constructed. Childhood itself was redefined. Where children had once worked alongside parents in varied tasks, industrial labor reduced them to replaceable parts in a machine, prompting growing concern and, eventually, reform. The environment paid a heavy price. Industrial England was a land of smoke-darkened skies, poisoned rivers, and denuded landscapes. Coal soot-coated buildings and lungs alike. Waterways became conduits for waste rather than sources of life. These changes were not seen as unintended consequences at the time, they were accepted as the cost of progress. Nature was increasingly viewed as a resource to be extracted, processed, and discarded. This mindset extended beyond England's borders, shaping imperial policy and global trade. Colonies supplied raw materials and absorbed manufactured goods, locking them into dependent economic roles that would persist long after formal empire faded. By the mid-19th century, the scale of industrial society forced reckoning. Epidemics of cholera and typhoid exposed the dangers of urban neglect. Investigations revealed the appalling conditions of mines and factories. Public pressure, combined with fear of social unrest, led to reforms that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Factory acts limited child labor and working hours. Sanitation systems were built. Education slowly expanded. These changes did not dismantle industrial capitalism, but they softened its sharpest edges. The state began to accept responsibility for the welfare of its citizens, not out of pure altruism, but because stability required it. Technological innovation continued relentlessly. Iron production gave way to steel. Steam power grew more efficient. Telegraphs collapsed communication time, allowing decisions made in London to affect markets and factories instantly. England became not just the workshop of the world, but a model others sought to imitate or challenge. Industrialization spread to Europe, North America, and eventually beyond, carried by British engineers, investors, and ideas. With it traveled a particular vision of progress: linear, measurable, and rooted in economic growth. By the late 19th century, England was a profoundly different nation from the agrarian society of 1700. Its cities dominated its economy. Its social classes were more rigidly defined, yet more politically aware. Its wealth was immense, its inequalities stark. The Industrial Revolution had not simply introduced new machines, it had reorganized time, labor, space, and power. It taught societies to think in terms of output, efficiency, and growth, often at the expense of community, environment, and human well-being. Yet it also generated movements for reform, concepts of rights, and the foundations of modern living standards. The world that emerged was neither wholly triumphant nor entirely tragic. It was complex, contradictory, and irreversible. England's experience between the 1700s and 1900s was not just a national story, but a global turning point. It revealed how technological change could amplify human capability while magnifying inequality, how economic systems could produce abundance and suffering simultaneously, and how progress, once set in motion, rarely asks permission from those it transforms. The smoke has long cleared from England's skies, but the structures built in that era continue to shape the modern world, reminding us that the forces unleashed in those centuries are still at work, quietly shaping lives in ways both seen and unseen. As factories multiplied, England's landscape began to change. Rivers were dammed and diverted. Canals were dug to move coal, iron, and finished goods efficiently across the country. Towns that had once been minor market centers ballooned into industrial hubs almost overnight. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, and Liverpool grew with astonishing speed, drawing in thousands of workers seeking wages rather than subsistence. The promise was simple and seductive: steady income in a cash economy, freedom from the uncertainties of harvest and weather, and access to goods that had once been luxuries. The reality, however, was harsher. Cities grew faster than infrastructure. Housing was overcrowded and poorly built. Sanitation was minimal. Disease spread easily through dense populations living near polluted water and industrial waste. The industrial city was not designed for human flourishing. It was designed for production. Coal became the dark heart of this new system. England was fortunate, or cursed, to sit atop vast coal reserves close to the surface. Coal-powered steam engines, which liberated factories from rivers and allowed them to operate anywhere fuel could be transported. Steam did more than drive machines. It reshaped transportation itself. Railways/travel times connected inland towns to ports and knitted the nation into a single economic organism. Goods that once took weeks to move by cart could now travel in days or hours. Markets expanded. Prices fell. Competition intensified. Entire regions specialized in particular forms of production, binding their fortunes to global demand and distant consumers they would never meet. This acceleration created immense wealth, but it did not distribute it evenly. Factory owners, merchants, financiers, and inventors accumulated fortunes that rivaled or surpassed those of the old landed aristocracy. A new industrial bourgeoisie emerged, confident, influential, and increasingly vocal in politics. They argued that progress, efficiency, and free markets were not just profitable, but morally superior. In their view, industrial growth was evidence of national greatness and human advancement. Parliament slowly began to reflect their interests, reforming trade laws, expanding infrastructure, and protecting property rights. Meanwhile, the working class expanded into a mass social category for the first time. Men, women, and children sold their labor for wages, often under conditions that were exhausting, dangerous, and monotonous.